going to talk today about Domain 1, Planning and Preparation, which is part of the Danielson Framework for Effective Teaching. And I want to just let you know a little bit about myself. I am a longtime educator, was a teacher, specialist, curriculum director, and also principal. And as a principal, I use this, the Danielson Framework in my evaluations. And then also worked on EPAS with Montana State and became a Danielson trainer. So, and thank you for bearing with the recording. When we do the other 3 webinars in the series, it'll be more interactive because I'll be able to see you. But today I am recording this for another purpose. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and get started. So just a quick review. I always like to start with that to be sure we're on the same page. So the Danielson Framework for teaching, of course, comes out of a lot of research that Charlotte Danielson did or has done through the years, 20 years or so, about what really impacts student learning, what types of teaching behaviors really impact student learning. And that's a good reminder too that when we're talking about these components of the framework, we're always talking about teaching behavior, not the teacher as a person. And sometimes it's easy to think about that, particularly when you get into evaluation and think, oh, this is a proficient teacher. But really we're describing behaviors that are effective. And so obviously if you have a lot of behaviors that are effective, you probably are an effective teacher. But really thinking about it in that way helps guide conversations, particularly between peers and between evaluators and teachers. So the framework is divided into 4 quadrants. First is planning and preparation, and that's the one we're going to dig into a little deeper today. The second one is environment. The third one is instruction. And the fourth one is one we don't often talk about, but it has become my favorite, and that is professional responsibilities. And so it's very, the framework has been developed very purposefully in this order, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We'll talk about why that is. But you see the division between blue and beige on the screen. The blue is the things that are seen behind the scenes. They're the things that you gather evidence for, and artifacts for, or I should say you gather artifacts for, but they aren't necessarily the things that you would be observing every day when a teacher's standing in front of a class room. Conversely, the things in beige are the ones that are on the stage. They're the things that if I'm the evaluator and I walk into the classroom, those are the things I'm going to gather evidence on. Those are the things I'm going to write down what I see happening, what I hear the students saying, what I hear the teacher saying, that direct evidence of either classroom environment, managing those procedures, the culture of respect and rapport, those kinds of things, or actual instruction of a lesson. So that's the relationship between 2 and 3 and 1 and 4, but also there's an interesting relationship between quadrant 1, planning and preparation, and instruction. Those are absolutely directly connected. So as you're planning and preparing, you're building that instructional piece that then you observe when you go into the classroom. Quadrant 1 and quadrant 3 should be in evidence in every single lesson. In other words, you should be able to dig into the planning and preparation and also see the execution of it every time a lesson is taught. However, domains 2 and, whoops, I need to practice using my hands better. Domains 2 and domain 4 are things that will get set up, but also mostly are in observance over the course of a year. So let me give you an example. In classroom environment, if I walk into a classroom on the first day of school as a kindergarten and look at a kindergarten class, it's going to look a little different than the last day of school. So in evaluation or observing or thinking about seeing what's going on and getting that evidence in domain 2, you would want to go in multiple times. See those procedures as the students develop through the year. See those things as the class comes together as a cohesive community. And those kinds of things then would be observed and written down over the course of the year. Not to say that when you go in to observe a lesson as a principal, you're of course going to make notes of this, but classroom environment is a really good place to make observations in walkthrough types of observations, so multiple snapshots. Same thing with professional responsibilities. You're not going to see every single day a newsletter going home to parents, for example. You would see it maybe once a week or a couple times a month or whatever. So getting that pattern of professional behavior or what professional development a teacher would go to during the year. So those are kinds of the relationships that matter when we're talking about the framework. The domains are the big categories, and then we have the components, which describe the teaching behaviors in those domains. And I'm just going to list them out here and not talk a lot about them, because the ones we're going to dig into, that's what we're going to dig into today, is those components for domain 1. But more importantly, as I said, the framework was designed in this manner with 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this order, so that we can see this circuitous action process of planning. In other words, you have to think when you're planning, and it moves into classroom environment, and then instruction and professional responsibility. We were talking about how the framework is designed purposefully to cover this Petra cycle, which is plan, teach, reflect. So domains 1 and 2 really are working on planning and setting up everything for success. Then the actual 2 and 3 are the actual physical piece of teaching it, or teaching a lesson. Then 3 and 4 have to do with stopping, reflecting, analyzing, thinking about what happened, and then applying what you have learned or what you are learning into that planning and preparation. So that consistency in the framework really helps you think about all the components that go into teaching. So also, just very quickly, it has become part of the observation process. So it's set up if you're doing an observation, a formal observation, or if you're being observed, that Petra cycle, that planning, teaching, reflecting, and then applying, all is built into that collaborative process where you have professional conversations, you think through your planning, you see it, observe it, and get evidence of that planning and execution, and then you reflect on it with an evaluative partner or a peer or yourself, and then you apply what you've learned to the next go around to build your practice. So it's all designed to fit together. Pretty cool. So we're going to talk about planning and preparation. Just a personal anecdote about this. As you're teaching and starting to teach, there's so much that you have to handle, and usually you're worried about the content, you're worried about setting up your classroom and managing behaviors and all of that kind of stuff as a brand new teacher. And I really saw my practice build and change about year 3 or 4 of my teaching, when I finally had that whole behavior, setting up, just executing a lesson, that kind of thing, a little more dialed in. And then I spent more time on the front end of my lessons, planning and preparing for them. And all of a sudden, things happened like behavior problems diminished, the content, the assessments that I was giving were a lot stronger. The kids seemed to be a lot more engaged and happier. And so it was interesting because we don't always think of time spent planning and preparing as a way to manage behaviors, or a way to manage grades and that kind of thing, or even a way to manage parents. And I found that the better prepared I was, the more in-depth time I spent on planning, the more I even worked with colleagues to plan things. All those other things that tend to take a lot of time away from teaching started to diminish. They didn't go away, but they started to diminish. So I really started to believe in the power of planning and preparation. So planning and preparation is what you do at midnight, during the weekend, or at night, or that kind of thing, to find resources, to prepare your lessons, to go over things, to think about how you're going to group students. So these are the things that you would not see in the classroom. And the important part of that is they are things that, as evaluators or as people who are building our own practice, we need to figure out what the artifacts are of how I'm doing with planning and preparation, because it's not visible. It's something that we need to think, how would I prove that I knew how to do X? And so we're going to, as I go through these components for planning and preparation, we're going to talk about the elements of each of those components. And I'm going to ask you, Tammy, a little bit about the indicators. What would you think of if you were observing someone, or if you were in your own practice, that would prove proficiency in this particular element? Because it's a little different than just observing things. So good, you don't have no specific questions at this time, and just getting on with goal planning. Yeah, really, no kidding. This is something that I will really harp on. Is, a lot of people say, well, we want to look at professional development goals, or we want to look at instructional goals, and that's all great, but I think you need to add in the planning and preparation piece, because it's so powerful and it changes practice when you get really good at it. There is, more often than not, I found that the lessons that really bombed were the ones that I rushed into at the last minute and was flying by the seat of my pants. Sometimes that worked out great, but most of the time it wasn't the best lesson. So let's think about that. So in domain 1, we've got two things. We've got knowing what a teacher knows, what's in his or her brain about teaching. And then we have doing. So what does a teacher do to get ready to execute really in-depth and engaging instruction? So it's what's in your head, what you know, and looking at that component 1A, content and pedagogy. What do you know about content? What do you know about teaching strategies? And again, we're going to delve into each one of these elements, and so I'm not going to say a lot more about it. But what do you know about students, about student development, those kinds of things? What do you as a teacher know about what resources are out there that will best engage students in their learning? And then what can you do, you as the professional, Do you know how to set instructional outcomes? Do you understand what an outcome is? Can you do that and set up your lessons so that they are aligned to those outcomes? Can you design assessments that match what your instructional outcomes are? Or are you just grabbing a test out of a resource manual from the reading series? And 1E, do you understand how to design instruction in a very coherent manner so that it isn't just random acts of teaching? And so those are the components in Domain 1, and it has to do with the teacher's competence and knowledge base about teaching. So that's pretty interesting because we don't always talk a lot about that. So the first one that we're going to delve into is the demonstrating knowledge of content and pedagogy. So this is the basic stuff, and of course I have funny stories about these things. But let's look at the elements that are defining these components. So in the Danielson Framework, it goes domain, component, and then elements. So under this component is knowledge of content and the structure of the discipline. So in other words, a teacher who is proficient and moving into distinguished has to have that deep understanding of the content. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be the world's most renowned authority on whatever it is, but you have to have the surety of the basic knowledge that you're trying to impart. Now, as an elementary teacher, I had 13 areas of curriculum to teach. I was certainly not an expert in all of them. I can, remember reading ahead of time the night before I was going to teach it, something about science. But if I know that about myself, and I know that that may be a weaker area, then that's where you can do some goal setting and say, you know what, I have a pretty strong background in language arts, but man, I did not have as strong a background in science. I need to find out more about XYZ. And that's where you can do so much professional development on your own. There's so many resources out there to learn about, birds or earth science or whatever it happens to be. So it is imperative that teachers get a depth of knowledge so that they can understand the relationships, the prerequisites, those kinds of things that go into the discipline that they're trying to teach. The other thing that a teacher needs to have is the understanding of how disciplines relate to one another. And this is where we get siloed teaching that is not really very helpful, because that's not the way the world works. Scientists do not walk over and say, okay, I'm not going to do any math today because I'm doing science. It's all very integrated. So knowledge of prerequisite relationships, understanding what you absolutely have to be firm on as a student so that you can handle the next thing. And knowledge of content-related pedagogy. What are those strategies? What are those instructional strategies that will work with this particular discipline? For example, the inquiry base in science is really a great way to get kids just mucking around with concepts and not worrying about, standing up with a big lecture, but getting them engaged in finding out and inquiring, and then coming to conclusions, and then coming back and finding out what the underpinnings of that content is. So one of the things that I think is interesting to think about with prerequisite relationships is, I know when the last school district I was in, there was a 30% mobility rate. And, in thinking about what the prerequisite knowledge is, the transitory nature of our schools is really, I think, impacting how we teach. And so do you have a way to find out what new students to your class are who come in the middle of the year, for example, and haven't been at your school for a long time? Do you have a way to find out about what they know and then fill in those gaps? So understanding what prerequisite knowledge is needed in that concept is really key to differentiating appropriately. So those are just some things to think about. I've got a few notes right there. The other thing, thinking about being moving into a distinguished practice in these things. A proficient teacher, a basic teacher, has a little bit of knowledge about this type of thing. And then a proficient teacher gets a lot more options. But as a distinguished teacher, you have a wide array of strategies to teach, ways to go with the content. And so in thinking about what makes the difference between proficient and distinguished, think about it as opening up more and more options at your fingertips in order to get at the knowledge that you know the kids need to have. So in thinking about 1A, then what would be an indicator, what would be evidence of teaching practice in knowledge of content and pedagogy? And one thing particularly for 1A that I would say is have that conversation when before you observe a lesson, and have some guiding questions, which brings up my next slide. Some of these things that you might want to think about. Now, if you're a teacher, you can think about it for yourself. If you're a principal, you could think about asking it in a pre-conference conversation. In what ways does the lesson plan identify prerequisite knowledge or skills necessary for student success? So is a lesson plan just a list of activities, cool things you're going to do? Or is there some reference there that shows, yeah, this teacher's very thoughtful about, well, they need to know this before I can move on here, or, they're going to be able to have to do X, Y, Z. So that's a good guiding question. How is the teacher identifying connections with other subjects within their lesson plan? And again, we want to really urge teachers to get away from that siloing. It's Tuesday, it's math, so therefore I'm on page 11. No, not really. Let's put it into an application base. And number 3, how does the teacher identify common misconceptions and plans to address the issues if they arise? So do they understand the content enough to know what errors or what misconceptions typically come up in beginning learners about that particular concept? So in each component, I'm going to show you some guiding questions, and I can certainly email those to you too. If you'd like them, just let me know. All right, let's move on to knowledge of students. This one is sort of a duh, I guess, but it is pretty complex because, our kids come to us in lots of different packages with lots of different baggage. And so first of all, just a basic knowledge of child and adolescent development. I've seen teachers who, we had a high school football coach, and we did just for fun, a switch teaching assignments for like half a day, and he was assigned to the kindergarten. And at first he was like, whoa, but of course he, being a coach, he jumped in, and after a minute he kind of thought about it and thought about where they were. But there's nothing worse, and I know we've probably all experienced teachers like this, particularly in college, where they're so far above everything, and they're so into the content, and they can't understand why you as a student can't just understand it. So understanding how kids learn, how they learn it differently at different stages of life, is so key, and all of that great information that's out about brain development, of course, goes into this particular component a lot. Knowledge of the learning process. I have the opportunity to work with businesses and actually break down their training programs, and it's so fun because they know the content, but they don't understand how people learn. And so understanding how people learn, and how to review and how to summarize and all of that good stuff, because it's a brain thing, you've got to understand how that process works for the student. Knowledge of the student's skills and knowledge and language proficiency. Obviously, what a kiddo learns is influenced by their previous knowledge, like we've talked about before, their previous skill level, and also the models that they have in their lives about how the people around them learn. If they have a family that reads a lot and that kind of thing, we know that the students will have a lot easier time of it. If they don't, then it's a lot harder. Knowledge of the student's interests and cultural heritage. So the background of a student influences their learning. I can remember an assignment that I had at one point when I was very, very young, before I was a teacher, on a reservation. And I didn't realize that the students would not look me in the eye. And I had no clue that was, to them, a sign of disrespect if they looked me in the eye. And of course, in my culture, it was more appropriate to look straight on a person, and that was a sign of honesty and engagement. And so understanding how different cultures that students come from, it's important. And then also just knowing what they're into. And surveys are great for that, understanding what they're interested in, and taking notice of that and weaving that into the things that you're teaching. Knowledge of students' special needs, and I think we do spend quite a bit of time on this usually, just because with RTI and special education and all of that kind of stuff that we do, which is very appropriate and very good, we really pay attention to students' needs, but also we need to be sure that we're paying attention to the abilities that they have and where they might be the strongest. So all of this knowing about kids is pretty complex, actually. So again, I'm going to just throw it back to you for a minute and say, all right, you need to, look at a teacher, work with them a little bit. Maybe they're struggling. Maybe you're trying to figure out kind of they just don't seem to be clicking with a student or a group of students. What would you look for as indicators that they really do understand a student's background or where the student is? The other thing that we need to really, really emphasize, I think, in our own practice as teachers, or if we're principals working with teachers, is that we teach students. We don't teach the content. And I hear this time and time again. Well, I've got to cover the content. And that's really not the case. You have to, if you cover the content, you smother the students. And so you really need to look at where the students are, meet them where they are, and take them where they want to go. But that might mean that you have a bunch of different things going on in a room, and that's absolutely true. The other part of this is keeping students in their zone of proximal development. So keeping them challenged enough that they're going to stay in the struggle, but they're going to fight a little bit for it, little cognitive sweat, but not so challenging that they're going to drown, and not so easy that they don't have to struggle at all. So that zone of proximal development is really a key piece of understanding how to meet students where they are and take them where they need to be. All right, moving on. Oh, questions, yes. So if I'm talking with a teacher or if I'm reflecting on my own practice, how does the lesson plan appear to differentiate instruction in order to support all students? And here's when you're talking about using listening to the language that teachers use. If somebody's saying all students, then it really truly does need to be every single student. You can't just say, well, they're just not going to get it. You know, Johnny never gets it. Not okay. If you say all, you need to mean all, and we do want all students to learn as much as they possibly can. What are some ways that the lesson plan identifies students or groups of students who might need additional support? And on this one, just because my background's in gifted education, I also want to remind everyone that additional support doesn't always mean just for students who have a learning disability, for example. It also means for those students who need that zone of proximal development and be challenged further than they've already gone, even if they've already mastered what you're going to teach. So additional support means for all students. How does the lesson plan, sorry, I got to dance back and forth, show integration of student interests and cultural backgrounds? Have you taken that into effect? One of my teaching assignments was with students who spoke 8 different languages plus English, and we had so much fun, so much misunderstanding, but so much fun. And when you have that real diversity, using that as a strength rather than a hindrance to learning is great. All right, let's move on to instructional outcomes, which is the next component, 1C. These are talking about, when you hear the word best practices, this is what really is one of the golden nuggets of planning, is understanding that you have to start with the end in mind. You know, there's curriculum designed by, from the end. Understanding by design is thinking about the end first and then backing up. But too many times, we as teachers plan by activity. So what am I going to do first, second, third? Oh, now that was fun. That was a good unit. But really we need to change our thinking to say, what learning outcomes, what instructional outcomes do I have, and how am I going to align my instruction to that? So within this component are the elements of value sequence and alignment, clarity, and suitability for diverse students. So value sequence and alignment has to do with understanding the standards and how important they are for clarity. Excuse me. If lesson plans are vague, then it's going to be really, really hard for the students to achieve very well at all. They have to be sequenced, they need to be aligned, and remember that in clarity, excuse me again, outcomes refer to what students will learn, not what they do. This is outcomes. So what will they learn? And again, activities are what will they do. Outcomes are what will they learn. What do you want them to walk away with and even 2 months later or 2 years later understand at a really deep level? And then suitability for diverse students. What's appropriate for all students? Taking into account all of those things that we talked about in the component before. So what would you think would be indicators of this particular component, instructional outcomes? Questions for 1C: how is the teacher identifying what students will learn and not just what they'll do? So really focusing in, and I think your response of getting a unit plan, looking in to see if the outcomes are there, but also when we talk about designing assessments, are the assessments matching what they said the outcomes are? Because that's kind of the proof in the pudding. In what ways does the teacher align outcomes to state standards, and how in-depth are their understanding about the power of standards and what they're really for? I'm a standards kind of girl, and I love looking at the alignment, and now with the new state standards for most of the content areas, it's really helpful to have them already aligned. We used to do a lot of work with trying to align standards, so it's great to have that. All right, the next one is knowledge of resources, and this one is kind of a double-edged sword, I guess, because you can either get way lost in resources and kind of forget all of the other things that are important to planning and preparation and carrying out a lesson, or you can just use the few things that you have, pick up the textbook or, whatever it is you're comfortable with, and never diverge from that. And so I kind of see teachers in both spots, either trying to do too many novel things and use too many resources, or just, no matter what day it is, they're doing it the same way. So it's kind of a balance. So does a teacher have the understanding? And remember, planning and preparation is what a teacher knows and does. We're not talking yet about seeing it in the classroom. We're just talking about what they know about the resources and how to use them effectively. So resources for classroom use. Do the materials align with learning outcomes, or are they just cool things to do? That can be really a time sucker. And I know we all say, well, I can't do one more thing. I can't do one more thing. And sometimes, particularly in planning and preparation, this is a time where a teacher can say, or you can say to a teacher, you know what, let's look at the time you are spending on things, and let's see what's most effective. And maybe some of these resources that you're really trying to implement, maybe they're not as effective for this particular lesson as you thought they were, and maybe they're just kind of a time sucker, and you can, maybe you need to pull back. Or maybe there's a resource that would make this particular way of instruction, or this particular pedagogy, or this particular point that you want to make, maybe there's a resource there that is very easy to use and is much simpler and much more effective than the thing that you're spending hours copying off and cutting out, or whatever it is. So, in planning and preparation, this is where we can really do that time management effectively. Resources to extend content knowledge and pedagogy, materials to further your own professional knowledge about content. There are so many times I say to teachers, have you ever watched the teaching channel? And they say, no, never have. And that's a free resource. You can watch other teachers teaching the same concept that you want to teach. So, use those resources that are out there to get better and more effective at what you're doing. Resources for students, materials that are appropriately challenging for all students. Really important that if you've got diverse learners in a room, which of course you do, you have resources that are calibrated for those folks. I think it's Newsela or Newsella that will take current news stories and put them at different reading levels. Things like that, knowing about resources like that so that all of your students can access the same content, but do it in a way that fits their needs. I am not, because of time, going to go ahead and do this, but Tammy, you can certainly think about what indicators would you look for in a way that that teachers use resources? And the questions that you might think about are, what types of materials and resources are listed in the lesson plans? Where do they come from? Are they reliable sources? Or are they just some crazy thing that they Googled? Or is it all Pinterest? Or teacher pay teacher? Not to say that those things aren't bad. There's a place for them. But if you have a completely Pinterest classroom, I would be concerned that it was not as coherent as it needed to be. How does the teacher use a wide variety of materials that he or she's gathered for the students' particular needs? And do they just gather them and never use them? There's sometimes that going on too. And then what are some ways that the teacher integrates lessons and units above and beyond the textbook that are aligned with learning? There are so many great resources out there right now that really the textbooks are just support. They should never be what drives instruction or planning. It should be, and again, as the more distinguished you get, the more easily you use resources and the more options that you have. There's not just one way to do it. You know of many, many ways to do things. Okay, the next one is designing coherent instruction. And I'm glad we've gotten to this one, because this one to me is absolutely a real foundation. If you don't understand how to coherently design instruction, then you've got random acts of teaching going on that don't connect to anything, that make no sense to kids, and then you get the kids saying, when am I ever going to use this? Because you have not planned or prepared to demonstrate the bigger picture for instruction. So I love designing coherent instruction. I think it's really one, if I was in practice right now as a principal, that I would really drill into with a faculty and really help them understand what that meant. So the elements inside designing coherent instruction excuse me, are learning activities. So instruction designed to engage students and advance them through the content. Not just, and I taught with somebody who did this long, long ago. I'm sure nobody does it anymore. Hey, they were a first grade teacher, and September was apple month, and everything had apples in it, and anything that, any activity, any worksheet, any whatever she was going to do had to have an apple on it. And then October was pumpkins and bats, of course. And so that was how she decided what learning activities were going to happen. And so not coherent instruction. That, that is not what we're going for. We have to remember what those outcomes are and design the learning activities that focus like a laser on those outcomes. Aid to instructions are appropriate, and that goes back to materials and resources. This one's an interesting one because instructional grouping has to do with how engaged the students are going to be in the lesson. So knowing which kinds of groups are going to be the best strategy to get students engaged and learning the content. And not just doing one thing, not standing and lecturing only. So instructional grouping that you plan in domain 1, then is going to be certainly seen or organized in domain 2, and then observed in domain 3 when that lesson is happening. So, and then lesson, unit, and structure. Is there clear and sequence? Sequence lessons, is there unit structures? I love curriculum maps, starting with that big question, designing the learning outcomes, and then plotting and planning the sequence of events and activities and assessments that will get at those. I think indicators of designing coherent instruction, and then any other question that you might have that you would like me to answer, and then I'm going to finish up with the last component, so, and the guiding questions for this one. I'll give you a second to write that in. All right, let's finish up. So the guiding questions for 1E, if you're thinking about your own practice or you're talking with a teacher to try and get at whether or not they understand coherence of design, is, does the lesson plan that you're writing show a clear, recognizable structure? Is there a beginning, anticipatory set? Is there, some kind of knowledge gaining review or summary of points from before? Is there a middle? And then is there an end? Is there some kind of conclusion? What are some ways the learning activities support student engagement or student choice? So having room, having openness to engage students, to be able to let them take the knowledge as far as they can. When I'm talking with groups about standards-based grading, for example, and we say, okay, we're going to grade on a rubric of 1 to 4, and 1 is, struggles with it, 2's developing, 3's proficient, and 4 is exemplary, or whatever you want to term you want to use. Then we talk about the fact that you have to absolutely have things planned that allow the students to show proficiency, to show exemplary performance in that. If you want them to go beyond proficiency, what opportunities are you planning in for them to take it that far? And then how does the lesson plan fit with the overall unit plan and the goals for the year? So one of the things to think about is to help teachers understand, don't just plan for the day or the week, but also have a 6-week plan or a quarter plan. And then have a bigger picture. If I'm going to teach this concept in the fall, and then build on something, where do I want them to be in the spring with that concept? How does that all play together? And what am I going to need to do to get them ready to go on to the next year or to apply their knowledge in the next concepts that they're going to do? So when you're looking at evidence, you're going to want to see maybe some examples of a longer picture. And again, you might have a scope and sequence in your materials, but more importantly, how does that fit into the bigger picture? So you can't just rely on what's been printed by a publisher, because the publisher doesn't know the students. And remember, you teach the students, not the content. So how does that fit with the students? All right, let's talk about designing student assessment. And of course, this is really key, because if you don't align the assessment to the learning outcomes, then you are not going to have any indicator of where you need to go with those students. So the elements in this one have to do with congruence with instructional outcomes, as I just said. They have to match learning expectations. It also has to do with criteria and standards. What expectations do you have? Is just mastering it good enough? And what does mastery mean? Does that mean, in old grading terms, 80%? Does it mean 100%? And so you have to define that. One of the things that a master teacher will do is get students involved in defining the criteria for their learning. Not every single assignment, but those bigger learning outcomes. How will we know when we've gotten this? How will we understand it? What's important to show? And then designing formative assessment. So how do you design assessment for learning as part of the planning process? In other words, we're not just going to give a summative test at the end of the unit and grade it and put it on the report card and file it away. We want to be assessing all the time. And what does that mean? Does that mean paper and pencil all the time? Or are there other opportunities for assessment? And if I'm meeting with a teacher and they say, you know, I'm going to have individual conferences with the student and talk to them about their writing or whatever it is, then when I go in to observe that, I'm going to want to see if that really happens and if that teacher then takes notes, anecdotal notes of those conferences and then uses them to reflect on progress. So, and are assignments used for planning? Are they used to consider where to go next or maybe what to go back to? All of those kinds of things. So you can think about some indicators that you would want to see, some evidence that you would want to see of whether or not the teacher has knowledge of assessments. Now remember, in this particular one, we probably are not talking about looking at teachers giving a test. We're talking with teachers, or we're talking with ourselves, if we're the teacher, about, does this assessment align with my learning outcomes? Is this going to show what students know? Is this going to show their proficiency? Is this going to show their gaps? So you're really thinking through that design rather than actually what the students got on the assessment. That comes later. So, questions for 1F. How has the teacher planned for both formative and summative assessments in the lesson and in the unit overall? To what extent are the assessments directly aligned to intended learning outcomes? In other words, we're not just randomly assessing things. And this is one of the harder things in standards-based grading, for example, because there might be just small components of a bigger test that you're really wanting to get grades on. So wrangling all of that data and that information is sometimes difficult. What opportunities are there, let me do my little dance, are there for students to design and use measures for their own learning? Interesting. Interesting. Does a teacher have ways where the students can show what they know in their own way? Because one of the things we want to build into our lessons and into our learning is an opportunity for students to reflect on their own learning and then use their language to describe where they are, why they think they're there, and what they need to improve on or what they did really well on. Because that building that dialogue for a student will help them self-assess all along the way. So that's a really key part of designing assessment. It's not all about just what the teacher's going to do, but does the teacher plan in opportunities for the students to do it also? So, lessons learned, planning and preparation have to do with what a teacher knows and what they're able to do. This is the stuff, remember, that happens at midnight or the weekend before or in a planning PIR day, or it could be collaboratively with colleagues as you're planning the instruction and the outcomes, and you're looking at student data and you're designing assessments and you're going all over that to really plan coherent and thoughtful lessons. And again, I believe that planning and preparation is a way to start to look at the time that you spend on different things that you do in the classroom. and say which things are really going to have the most impact. I'm going to focus like a laser on those, and I'm going to give myself permission to take off the things that aren't as impactful. And so, therefore, I'm going to free up my time and my students' time to go deeper into the content rather than broader. You know, we've heard that expression, it's a mile wide and an inch deep. We want to really start pulling that in our planning and going deeper into our knowledge, into the students' knowledge. In order to do that, remember that we have to have the knowledge to go deeper. And there are a lot of ways to get that knowledge. There's a lot of resources out there. Also, we talked about the fact that resources and knowledge of resources are things that really make the lessons come alive, but they can also be distractors. And so finding those resources that, again, align with those learning outcomes and really focus that instruction in a deeper way, rather than just things that are cool to do or resources that are fun or, whatever. There's probably a time and place for some of those, but it may not be in the majority of the instruction that you're planning. A couple of resources for folks to look at, of course, is the evaluation instrument, which can be downloaded for free on danielsongroup.org. And go to resources and you can look at that rubric, and it defines every component in for every domain, and then also the levels of proficiency for that component. And then another book that you can pick up on Amazon, and this would be particularly for the administrators, is this one, which has a breakdown. It's actually, and I hate to say this because I don't like workbooks, but it's actually a workbook where it goes through each component and has exercises for that component, and it also has rubrics designed with language to help you think about each one of those things, those elements that we talked about. And it's particularly good if you're going to focus on professional development on a particular component to really dig into that, or if you have a teacher, and I'm speaking to principals primarily right now, if you have a teacher who is struggling with something in component or in domain 1 or in any of the domains, and really use this as a guide to coach them in those areas. That's another good use for it. So those are a couple resources to look at. I want to thank you very much for listening, and if you want to get a hold of me, my email is kathleen@inspiredclassroom.com. Check out our website, inspiredclassroom.com, for some great curriculum that's free to schools this year, problem-solving activities that are based in real-world experiences. So anyway, thank you so much, and have a good evening.